The town of Willowbrook had never seen a winter quite like this one. The cold had crept in early, settling over the town like a heavy blanket, making every breath feel sharp and distant. The lake, which was usually alive with fishermen in summer and families in autumn, was now a vast sheet of frozen ice, stretching out as far as the eye could see. The snow had settled thick on its surface, turning it into an uninviting, still expanse. It was here, on the edge of that frozen lake, that Max had taken his post. The first time Emily saw him, she didn't think much of it. She was new to Willowbrook, still adjusting to its slow pace, its quiet rhythm. Coming from the city, she'd found the stillness almost oppressive, the long stretches of empty roads and silent streets unnerving. Her dog, a spunky terrier named Jasper, had become her only company during her daily walks. But then she saw Max. The golden retriever wasn't moving. He sat on the ice, still as a statue, his fur fluffed with snow and his eyes fixed on a spot just beyond the horizon. Emily couldn't help but stare. The dog looked almost out of place. No one else was around. No tracks in the snow led up to him. No sign that anyone had been with him before. It wasn't like a stray dog, wandering aimlessly in search of food or shelter. Max wasn't even looking for something. He was waiting. She could feel it in the air. Max's eyes were so fixed, so intent, that it almost felt as if he were staring right through the ice, waiting for something, or someone, to emerge from the frozen depths. The chill in the air bit at her skin as Emily stood on the shore, watching the dog. It had been days since she had first noticed him, but still he hadn't moved. She thought he might be lost at first, but his calm demeanor didn't suggest panic or confusion. It suggested something deeper, a purpose. Curiosity gnawed at her, the way it always did when she didn't understand something. She tried to move closer, but the snow underfoot crunched loudly, and Max's ears perked up, though he didn't turn to face her. His gaze remained fixed on the same spot on the lake. Emily slowed her steps, unsure whether to approach. "Hey there, boy," she called softly, not wanting to startle him. Her voice was swallowed by the vastness of the quiet, her words seeming almost too loud for such an empty space. Max didn't respond. His posture didn't shift, and his focus didn't waver. Emily hesitated for a moment, then crouched down at the edge of the snowbank, her breath fogging in front of her face as she squinted to make out the details of the dog. He was larger than she'd originally thought, a golden retriever with a thick coat of fur that was matted from exposure to the cold. His tail lay limp beside him, untouched by the wind, and his eyes, a deep brown, were filled with something Emily couldn't quite place. It wasn't until the wind picked up, sweeping the snow in flurries around them, that Emily realized just how long the dog had been sitting there. His body was frozen, almost stiff, but his eyes, those eyes, still had a warmth to them, as if he had been waiting for something. Emily looked over her shoulder toward her own dog, Jasper, who was darting around in the snow, oblivious to the strange scene unfolding. She took another cautious step closer. The ice beneath her feet creaked, sending a slight tremor up her spine, but Max remained unmoved. She wasn't sure if it was his stillness or the sheer weight of his presence that made her feel as if she had stumbled upon something sacred. "I don't know if you're lost or if you're just waiting," she said quietly to herself, the words not meant to be heard, but spoken anyway. Her breath fogged up the air again, but the dog didn't flinch. Max had been here for days, she realized. The thoughts settled in her stomach, a mix of confusion and concern. Why wasn't he seeking warmth? Why didn't he move when the temperature plummeted, when the wind started to bite at every exposed inch of skin? As Emily stood there, unsure of what to do, she thought back to her first week in Willowbrook. The loneliness she felt as a newcomer had settled deep in her bones. She hadn't made any real connections yet. She had seen the locals pass by, exchange pleasantries, but nothing more. And here, standing on the edge of the lake, she realized she felt an odd connection to Max, even though she barely knew him. He was waiting for something or someone, and she too was waiting, though she wasn't sure for what. But what was it that kept Max here, unmoving? She looked out across the lake again. Was he waiting for someone to come back? As the sun began to dip lower, casting long shadows across the snow, Emily gave Max one last look and turned to leave. She could feel his gaze on her even though his head never shifted. The chill was unbearable now, the cold creeping through her layers. But as she walked away, she couldn't shake the feeling that the dog wasn't just lost. He was waiting for something. Or someone. She would return tomorrow. Maybe she would understand then. Or maybe she realized she would simply keep wondering. The next day, Emily found herself back at the lake, her breath misting in the cold air as she walked toward Max, who was still sitting at his post, unwavering in the frigid landscape. Her mind had been racing since her last visit. There was something about the dog's behavior, something that gnawed at her, pulling her in. The question that had lodged itself in her thoughts was simple yet profound. Why? As she approached, she saw the familiar figure of Mrs. Abbott, an elderly woman who owned a small thrift store on Main Street. Emily had spoken with her briefly a few times since moving to Willowbrook, always exchanging pleasantries. Mrs. Abbott was the first to break the silence between them when she spotted Emily walking toward Max. "Ah, you've noticed him too, huh?" Mrs. Abbott said, her voice tinged with a touch of sadness as she adjusted the woolen scarf around her neck. Emily nodded, her gaze drawn to Max, who still hadn't moved a muscle. "Poor thing," Mrs. Abbott muttered, more to herself than to Emily. "He's been here for days now. Just won't leave. Doesn't even eat. Do you know who he belongs to?" Emily asked, her voice softer now. There was something in the way Max sat so still, his eyes fixed on the horizon, that made her wonder if she was witnessing something far deeper than she could understand. Mrs. Abbott sighed, a knowing look crossing her weathered face. "His name is Max. He belongs to James. James Hawthorne, the fisherman. Everyone around here knows him. He's a quiet man, keeps to himself mostly. But Max? He's his heart." Emily's brow furrowed. She had heard the name before, James Hawthorne, the town's local fisherman, but she hadn't paid much attention to the whispers surrounding him. She knew there had been a tragedy recently, but no one had ever given her the full story. "James, what happened to him?" Emily asked, her voice tentative. Mrs. Abbott's face clouded with sorrow as she glanced at Max, still sitting motionless on the ice. "A few days ago, James went out to the lake. It was early morning, before the sun had come up. He was checking his fishing traps, like he always does. But the ice, it was too thin in some parts. It cracked under him. He fell in, and..." She trailed off, her voice breaking. "The search went on for hours, but no one could find him. They declared him lost." Emily's stomach tightened. She hadn't known the full extent of what had happened. The search parties, the efforts to recover James's body. It all seemed so final. But here was Max, still waiting, still believing. Did they find him? Emily asked, her throat dry. Mrs. Abbott shook her head slowly. "Not yet. The ice is too thick. They're hoping the thaw will help. But who knows? If the waters are too deep? Well, sometimes it's better not to know." Emily felt a lump form in her throat. The image of Max waiting for his owner, the grief of the dog, was now more poignant than ever. He hadn't just been sitting idly on the ice. He had been waiting for his person to come back. And Emily, with her own struggles and loneliness, could almost feel the bond between them, even though she wasn't part of it. It was the kind of loyalty that defied explanation. It was pure and raw. "Max doesn't understand, does he?" Emily murmured more to herself than to Mrs. Abbott. "No, dear," Mrs. Abbott replied softly. "He doesn't understand. Dogs don't always know what we know, but they love in ways we can't always comprehend. James has been Max's whole world, and now, well, Max doesn't know how to let him go." Emily's gaze shifted back to the dog, whose golden coat glistened faintly under the low sun. There was a kind of beauty in his stillness, a quiet reverence that only deepened the sorrow she felt for him. She wondered if Max could sense that something had happened to James, or if he was simply holding on to the belief that James would return, just like he always did after a long day of fishing. Max's life, it seemed, had always been tied to James's. He was the dog who waited by the door every morning, the dog who would run to meet him after a long day at work, the dog who shared quiet moments with James in the evenings. Max wasn't just waiting for any person. He was waiting for his person, the one who had been his constant, his companion, his family. "I never realized," Emily whispered, feeling a lump form in her throat. "How does he do it?" How can he just wait like this? Mrs. Abbott chuckled softly, but there was no humor in it, only a quiet sadness. Love like that doesn't have a timeline. Max doesn't need a reason to wait. He's just waiting for his heart to come home. And in his world, that's all that matters. For a long moment, Emily stood there, her heart heavy with a grief that wasn't even her own. Max had given up everything to stay by the lake, enduring the cold and the loneliness because he believed, somewhere deep in his soul, that his owner would come back. The love between them was simple and pure, a love that couldn't be broken by time or distance, or even death, it seemed. I don't think he'll ever leave until he's sure James is really gone, Emily said quietly, more to herself now. Mrs. Abbott nodded, her face softening. I'm afraid you're right. Max will wait for as long as it takes. And if James doesn't return, well, Max will carry him in his heart, even if he never understands. Emily stood there for a while longer, feeling the weight of the moment pressed down on her chest. She looked at Max, who had never shifted his gaze from the distant horizon. She wondered if the dog could feel her presence, but it was as though he had locked himself into a place only he could see, a place where James was still out there, still alive, still coming home. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows over the frozen lake, Emily stood with Mrs. Abbott, silently witnessing the kind of love that could not be explained. There were no words to describe it, no way to quantify the deep bond between a man and his dog. But she understood it now, and somewhere deep inside, she knew that Max would never give up. Not until James came home, or until his heart could no longer wait. As the days turned into weeks, the winter seemed to grow colder, and the town of Willowbrook, though small, became quieter. The locals, used to the rhythm of the seasons, went about their business, but the presence of Max on the frozen lake began to weigh on everyone. He was no longer just a dog waiting for his owner. He had become a symbol of the town's collective grief. Each day, Emily found herself walking to the lake, her heart heavy with the thought of Max, who was still there, waiting. She had tried everything she could think of to get the dog to move. The first time she had seen him, she had gently tried to coax him with food, hoping that he might respond. But Max had barely glanced at her. His focus remained steadfastly on the horizon, his tail unmoving, his eyes unblinking. Max, you have to come inside, Emily would say, her voice breaking the cold silence that enveloped him. It's too cold for you out here. But Max never responded. He didn't shiver or shake from the freezing temperatures, and he didn't growl or bark when Emily approached. He simply sat unmoving, as if the world around him had ceased to exist. The only sign that he was still alive was the soft rise and fall of his chest. At night, Emily would sometimes lie awake in her small cottage, the wind howling outside, and wonder what was going through the dog's mind. Did he know James was gone? Or was he trapped in a never-ending loop of waiting, as if somehow, if he stayed long enough, James would come back? One particularly cold evening, Emily found herself at the lake later than usual. The sun had long since set, leaving a pale grayness in the sky. Snowflakes drifted down, soft and silent, adding another layer to the already thick blanket on the ice. She had a thermos of hot tea in her hand, hoping to warm herself from the inside out, but it wasn't the cold that made her shiver. It was the sight of Max, still sitting in the same spot he had occupied for days, weeks now. She approached him slowly, feeling the weight of his sorrow settle over her. She crouched down beside him, letting the soft crunch of her boots in the snow fill the silence. The world felt impossibly still, as though time itself had slowed to accommodate Max's vigil. "Hey, boy," she murmured, reaching out a hand toward his fur, which was matted and crusted with ice. His coat used to shine brightly in the sun, but now it was dull, weighed down by the harsh elements. Still, Max didn't move. "I wish I could make you understand that James isn't coming back. I wish I could make you let go of that hope." Her voice was gentle, but there was an ache in it, the kind of ache that comes from not knowing how to help, from seeing a creature in so much pain and knowing you can't fix it. Emily didn't understand why Max refused to move. He had to be cold. He had to be hungry. And yet, each day he remained steadfast, as though time had no meaning, as though James's return was a matter of when. not if. As Emily sat there beside him, a strange sense of connection blossomed within her. She understood, in a way, what Max was doing. She, too, had been waiting for something to shift in her life, waiting for a change that never seemed to come. She had come to Willowbrook hoping to start fresh, to leave behind the heartbreak of her past, but she found herself still clinging to pieces of what she had lost. Much like Max, she had trouble letting go. For a long time, Emily just sat there, silently accompanying Max in his vigil. She didn't speak. There was no need for words. The silence between them was heavy enough. She could feel the weight of his sorrow, the sheer force of his loyalty. It was as if he had no concept of time, only of the promise he had made to James to wait. And wait, he would. It was then that Emily realized something she hadn't fully understood before. Max wasn't just waiting for James to come back. He was waiting for closure. He was waiting for something final, something that would confirm that his owner wasn't coming back. Not because he wanted to let go, but because he needed to understand why. The realization struck her like a bolt of lightning. Max couldn't simply walk away, because there was no resolution in his heart. There was no end. James had never said goodbye. The lake had swallowed him whole, leaving only questions behind. Without closure, Max couldn't move on. Tears pricked at the corners of Emily's eyes, and she wiped them away angrily. She hadn't expected to be so moved by a dog. But here she was crying for a dog that was so devoted to someone who was never coming back. She reached out and placed a hand gently on Max's head, her fingers brushing through the cold, damp fur. His warmth, so small and fragile against the frozen world, was a stark reminder of what had been lost. "I don't know how to help you, Max," she whispered, "but I'll be here. I'll sit with you. I won't let you be alone in this." Max's eyes, as soft and brown as melted chocolate, remained fixed on the empty expanse of ice. But for a fleeting moment, just a moment, Emily thought she saw a flicker of understanding in his gaze. It was as if he knew she wasn't giving up on him, even if he couldn't bring himself to leave the lake, even if he didn't understand why he was waiting. As the days wore on, Emily returned to the lake again and again, her presence beside Max becoming a quiet, unspoken routine. She would sit for hours beside him, sometimes just watching the sunset, sometimes sharing her thoughts with him in the cold silence. She knew she couldn't make him understand that James was gone, but she hoped, in some small way, her presence might help Max begin to heal. Max, though still as resolute as ever, seemed to soften in her company. He no longer looked at her with indifference, but with a sort of quiet acknowledgement. Maybe he had begun to realize that while he couldn't control when James would come home, he could allow himself to share this burden, this waiting, with someone who cared. The thaw had not yet come, but something within Emily had started to thaw. She was no longer the lonely woman she had been when she arrived in Willowbrook. Watching Max, so steadfast in his grief, had given her a sense of purpose. She would not let him suffer alone, just as she had spent so much of her life alone. And in that shared silence, in that mutual understanding, they both began to heal, one day at a time. The weeks passed, each colder than the last, and the townspeople began to speak of Max with a mixture of pity and admiration. He had become something of a legend in Willowbrook, the dog who refused to leave the ice, who sat day after day, his body stiff with cold, his eyes never straying from the same spot. There was an unspoken respect for the animal's loyalty, but there was also a quiet fear. No one dared disturb his vigil, afraid of intruding on something sacred. Emily, though, couldn't stay away. The more time she spent with Max, the more she felt drawn to him, as though the dog's grief mirrored her own in ways she hadn't fully realized. Each day, she brought him food, sometimes a hot meal, sometimes just a little bit of warmth, though she knew it wasn't enough. Still, he never moved. He hardly even acknowledged her presence. But she continued to sit with him, and slowly, something inside her began to change. She started bringing her sketchbook with her, sitting by Max as he stared at the horizon. The stillness of the lake, the untouched snow, and Max's unwavering patience became her muse. She sketched the dog in various positions, his eyes locked on the empty expanse of ice, his head bowed in quiet surrender, his body sitting tall despite the freezing temperatures. In every line, every stroke, she saw a reflection of herself, stuck, waiting for something she couldn't quite name. One afternoon, after the first real thaw had begun to break through the ice, Emily arrived at the lake and noticed something was different. Max wasn't sitting where he usually did. Panic rose in her chest as she scanned the area, but there was no sign of him. The lake stretched out before her, the ice thinning under the sunlight, the snow melting into slush at the edges. "Max," she called, her voice trembling. She had grown so accustomed to his presence, his stillness, that the sudden absence of it felt like a hole in her heart. Her footsteps quickened as she moved along the lake's edge, her breath coming faster with each passing second. She rounded a corner, her eyes scanning desperately for any sign of the golden retriever. And there, just beyond a stand of trees, was Max, standing on the edge of the lake. His posture was different now, no longer the rigid stillness of someone waiting for a return that would never come. His head was turned toward her, his eyes wide and alert, and his tail, though weak, was wagging ever so slightly. For a moment, Emily stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. It was as if Max had made a decision, a choice to finally move on from his vigil, but something still held him in place. He didn't approach her immediately. Instead, he simply watched her, his gaze intense, as though he were testing whether she would stay or walk away. "Max," Emily whispered again, her voice barely above a breath. She stepped forward cautiously, unsure of what the dog would do. But when Max's tail gave a stronger wag, she took it as a sign that she could approach him. She knelt down to his level, keeping her movements slow, her voice calm. "It's okay, Max. You don't have to wait anymore." Max didn't bark or leap into her arms. Instead, he came closer, his movements slow and deliberate. Emily's hand trembled as she reached out, gently placing her fingers on the side of his face. His fur was still thick and matted, but under the coldness, there was warmth. He nuzzled her hand with a quiet sigh, and for the first time in weeks, Emily felt as though a weight was lifting. She didn't know if Max could understand her words, but in that moment, she felt an unspoken connection, a shared understanding that this moment of peace was something they both desperately needed. For a long while, neither of them moved. Max stood by her side, leaning into her presence, while Emily rested her head against his. The world seemed to have disappeared around them. It was just the two of them, standing on the edge of a lake that no longer seemed as cold and unyielding as it had before. Emily closed her eyes, letting the stillness wash over her. It was then that she realized that she too had been waiting for something to change in her life, waiting for the pain of her past to fade, waiting for some sign that she could move forward. And like Max, she had been holding on to a hope that she couldn't explain, even though it had long since passed its time. Max's breathing slowed as he leaned into her, and she felt the weight of his grief, not as something that belonged only to him, but as something that had also become a part of her. The pain of loss, of waiting without end, was something they both understood. And in that moment, Emily knew that there was no way to simply move on from such a bond. There were no easy answers, no simple conclusions. But maybe, just maybe, they could heal together. As the sun began to set, casting an amber glow over the lake, Emily looked down at Max. His gaze, no longer so distant, now seemed more grounded, more present. There was no longer the same unreachable longing in his eyes. The grief, though still there, had started to shift, to find its place in a world that wasn't as cold and unforgiving as it had once seemed. "Let's go home, Max," Emily said softly. She stood up, taking a hesitant step away, but Max followed her, his steps slower than hers but sure. He was still carrying his grief, but for the first time in a long time, he wasn't carrying it alone. As they walked back toward the town, the ice underfoot cracked and groaned, the thaw finally making its presence known. Emily felt the change in the air, the subtle shift that told her that the season was turning, not just for the lake, but for her as well. For the first time in a long time, Emily allowed herself to believe that there was life beyond the pain, life beyond the waiting. and maybe, just maybe, it was time to start moving forward one step at a time. The following days were marked by a subtle transformation. Willowbrook, still frozen under the weight of winter, seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for the moment when the last traces of grief would lift from its shores. The ice that had held Max in its grip for so long began to crack and melt, signaling the end of winter's harsh rain. And with that shift came the realization that Max, too, was beginning to change. His vigil by the lake had lessened in its intensity, and for the first time since Emily had met him, she began to see traces of the dog he had once been. Playful, affectionate, even curious. Emily continued to visit him each day, but now their time together was different. Max no longer seemed consumed by an unyielding need to wait. Instead, he would often wander with Emily along the shores, his head held high as he sniffed the air, no longer tethered to the frozen expanse of the lake. He seemed to be exploring the world around him, a tentative first step toward rediscovery. One morning, after a particularly warm spring rain had washed over the town, Emily arrived at the lake to find Max sitting by the water's edge, staring into the gently flowing stream that had once been a solid sheet of ice. She approached him slowly, feeling a bittersweet pang in her chest as she watched him. "Hey boy," Emily called softly. Her voice carried through the mist that hung over the water. She felt the weight of the years that had passed, the loss of James, and the lingering grief she had shared with Max. They had been bound by a shared silence for so long, but now she felt a strange sense of closure, a quiet understanding that their journeys, though different, were leading them in the same direction. Max turned his head toward her, his eyes no longer filled with the same hollow ache they once had. His gaze was clearer now, as if the fog had lifted, and Emily could see something new in his expression. There was no longer the intense, unyielding loyalty that had kept him tethered to the lake for so long. Instead, there was a sense of acceptance, of peace, a calm that Emily had not seen in him before. She sat beside him, not reaching for him immediately, but letting the stillness between them stretch into something comfortable, something that no longer needed to be filled with words. "It's time, isn't it?" Emily whispered, more to herself than to Max. The words felt heavy on her tongue, as though they were the ones she had been waiting to say, the ones she had been too afraid to voice. But she knew it was true. Max had waited long enough, and so had she. Max's ears twitched, but he did not move. His gaze lingered on the water, his tail twitching faintly at the sound of a distant bird's call. For a long while, neither of them spoke. Emily's thoughts swirled. She had spent so much of her life waiting too. Waiting for things to change, for the pain to ease, for some sign that she could move forward. And yet, just as Max had done, she had clung to the past in the hopes that it would come back to her. But it didn't. In that moment, as the last remnants of winter melted away, Emily realized something profound. Sometimes, closure wasn't something you could force. It wasn't something you could demand from the world or from another person. It was something that came quietly, softly, in moments like this, when you no longer had to fight against the tide of grief, but could instead let it flow away as gently as the spring rain had washed over the town. She reached out slowly, her fingers brushing against Max's fur. He didn't flinch or pull away. Instead, he leaned into her touch, his head resting against her hand. His coat was softer now, his body warmer, and for the first time, Emily felt the weight of his loyalty no longer as a burden, but as a gift. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. It was a simple phrase, but it held so much meaning. She had never known how much she needed this moment, how much she needed to say goodbye, not just to Max's grief, but to her own. Max let out a soft sigh and closed his eyes, the tension in his body releasing as he gave in to the moment. Emily could feel the quiet acceptance that had taken root in him, and in her too. The grief was still there, lingering beneath the surface, but it was no longer all-consuming. They had both learned, in their own ways, that it was okay to let go. It was okay to stop waiting for something that could never come back. The sun was breaking through the clouds now, casting a golden glow across the water. Emily stood slowly, Max following her without hesitation. She reached for his collar, her fingers grazing the worn fabric as she gently clipped the leash onto it. It was the first time she had done so without feeling as though she were forcing him to move. This time, he was ready. They walked together back toward the town, side by side, the silence between them no longer filled with sorrow, but with a quiet sense of understanding. Max was no longer the dog who sat on the ice, waiting for a return that would never come. And Emily was no longer the woman who clung to the past, trapped in a cycle of grief and longing. As they reached the edge of the town, Emily paused for a moment, looking back at the lake. The place that had held so much pain for both of them now felt different, smaller, less imposing. The ice had finally melted, and the world had opened up, just as it had for her. Max nudged her hand, his eyes bright and eager, as though to remind her that there was life beyond the grief, beyond the waiting. She smiled softly and bent down to give him a final pat on the head. "Let's go home, Max," she said, her voice steady with the quiet strength she had found within herself. And for the first time in a long while, Emily felt truly at peace, knowing that the journey they had shared had come to its natural end, and the next chapter was already beginning. Spring was finally taking hold in Willowbrook. The last remnants of snow had melted into the earth, and the air had a new softness to it, the kind that only comes with the season of renewal. The trees were beginning to bud, their pale green leaves unfurling as if stretching toward the sun for the first time in months. The town, once muted under the weight of winter, had come alive again. The streets were filled with the soft hum of life. Children running by with laughter, the distant sound of dogs barking, and the familiar chime of shopkeepers opening their stores for the day. Emily stood at the threshold of her small cottage, taking in the scene before her. She had been living here for over a year now, and yet for the first time, she truly felt like she belonged. The house, though simple, had become her sanctuary. It was a place where she could breathe, where she could shed the weight of her past and embrace the possibility of the future. Max, ever at her side, sat on the porch steps, his gaze lingering on the yard where the wildflowers were beginning to bloom. He looked different now, healthier, more at ease, as though he had finally shed the grief that had held him captive. His coat had regained its luster, and his eyes, once clouded with sorrow, now sparkled with life. But it wasn't just Max who had changed. Emily had too. The weeks that followed their quiet goodbye by the lake had been transformative. Emily had started to embrace the small joys of life again. She went for walks in the woods, rediscovered her love for sketching, and even started visiting the local cafe where she'd once avoided conversations, too consumed by her own sorrow to engage with the world around her. She had begun to rebuild herself, piece by piece, without even realizing it. Max had been a constant companion during this journey, his presence grounding her when the world felt overwhelming. Their bond had deepened, no longer just rooted in shared loss, but in mutual healing. He had become not only her loyal friend, but also her silent teacher, showing her the value of patience and acceptance, of allowing oneself to grieve and then, eventually, to let go. One afternoon, as they walked through the town, Emily's steps slowed as they neared the local park. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the grass. There were families gathered, children running around with kites, and couples lounging on benches. It was the kind of scene Emily had once avoided, feeling like an outsider in a world that seemed to move on without her. But today, there was no bitterness, no sense of being left behind. "Hey, Max," she said softly, turning to the dog who trotted happily beside her. "Let's take a seat." They found an empty bench near the playground, and Emily sat down, her fingers brushing the warm wood beneath her. Max lay down at her feet, his head resting on his paws as he looked up at her, his eyes content. Emily exhaled deeply, the weight of the past no longer holding her down. She had come to realize that healing wasn't about forgetting or erasing the pain. It was about learning to live alongside it, to carry it with you but not let it define who you were. She had been through so much grief, loss, confusion, but she had survived. And more than that, she had learned to grow. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her out of her thoughts. She glanced at the screen and smiled softly when she saw the message from her friend Sarah, the only person who had truly stuck by her through the darkest days. "Sarah, thinking of you today. How are you? Can we meet for coffee tomorrow?" For the first time in a long while, Emily felt excited about the idea. She had distanced herself from many of her old friends, too consumed with the aftermath of James' disappearance and her own grief to maintain connections. But now, things felt different. She was ready to open herself up to the world again, to let people in, to rebuild the connections that had been fractured by her own isolation. She quickly typed a response, her fingers moving easily over the screen. "Emily, I'd love to. How about 10 a.m. at the cafe?" As she sent the message, a sense of lightness filled her chest. It was a small step, just a coffee date, but it felt like a giant leap forward. She was ready to embrace life again, to allow herself the freedom to feel joy, even in the midst of the pain that still lingered. Max raised his head at the sound of her voice, and she smiled down at him. He looked up at her, his eyes soft with affection. In that moment, Emily realized just how much she owed to him. He had been her rock, her anchor when the world felt unsteady. And in return, she had given him something too: her presence, her patience, her willingness to heal. For so long, they had both been trapped in their own grief, unable to move forward. But now, they were walking side by side, no longer weighed down by the past. They had found their way out of the storm together, and now they could finally enjoy the calm. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a golden hue across the park, Emily felt a wave of gratitude wash over her. She didn't know what the future held. There were still unanswered questions, still pieces of her life that needed to be put back together. But for the first time in a long while, she didn't need to have all the answers. She didn't need to have it all figured out. She only needed to keep moving forward, one step at a time, and trust that with time, the path would become clearer. And for the first time, she felt ready to do just that. "Come on, Max," she said with a soft laugh, standing up from the bench. "Let's go home." Max leapt to his feet, his tail wagging in response to her words. As they walked back down the park path, the evening air cool and fresh, Emily knew that this was just the beginning of something new, something beautiful. She didn't need to know exactly what it would look like. She only needed to trust that it would come. And with Max by her side, there was no longer any doubt. I know you guys have already subscribed till now, but if you have not, do like, share, and subscribe.